We look at two examples of protest in our country, and we see stark examples of differences. So while there are numerous factors that led to the horrific assault on our Capitol on January 6th, there is also a racial dimension that is unmistakable, yet one more consequence of our country's history. A quick recap from last week. During the 20th century, we looked at circumstances of significant housing segregation and the role played by the FHA, discrimination in public policy that included Social Security and the implementation of the GI Bill. We saw the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court and the massive resistance that resulted. The heroic activists and the significant events of the Civil Rights Movement, and finally passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So today, as we turn to the question of mass incarceration and specifically the role of the war on drugs, looking historically, we actually see three phases, if you will, of mass incarceration. The first was certainly the institution of slavery between 1640 and 1865. And then in class 2, we looked at the implications of legislation such as Black codes that led really to slavery by another name, the institution of convict leasing that lasted from 1846 to 1928 and actually continues in a modified form in many of our prisons even today. And now we turn our attention to phase 3, which began in the early 1970s, mass incarceration and the war on drugs. The United States is home to less than 5% of the world population, but we have 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, there were 200,000 Americans incarcerated. By 2017, that number had increased by an order of magnitude to 2.3 million people. And today, there are more than 7 million people either incarcerated or on parole or probation. And as we look at the statistics, there has been a significantly disproportionate impact on people of color. No other country in the world incarcerates its minority populations at the rate that the United States does. And significantly, and sometimes invisibly, we are not aware that this is another form of slavery or bias or bigotry in that it is legal to discriminate against criminals. It is not legal to discriminate against Black people per se, according to law. But according to law, people convicted of a felony, regardless of whether it's violent or not, can be discriminated against in their ability to get housing, to participate in public programs, the SNAP program that helps feed their children, in education, and in access to jobs. And so the discrimination continues. So what do we know about the people who are incarcerated? These statistics are from 2010, and it shows the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 people in that population. So 380 white people of every 100,000 are incarcerated, almost 1,000 Latinos, and more than 2,200 African Americans per 100,000 are incarcerated. Now there's going to be a test on this next chart, so pay close attention. Of the 2.3 million Americans incarcerated, more than half are held in state prisons, 631,000 in local jails, and something less than 250,000 in federal prisons and jails. Of those 2.3 million people, 450,000 are there because of drug offenses. 900,000 are there because of a violent offense of some sort. Yet we need to bear in mind that there are certain offenses that are categorized as violent when in reality, no violence actually occurred. And astonishingly, more than 500,000, 530,000 of those people are in jail awaiting trial. They have, not only have they not been found guilty, they have not even been tried. In some cases, they're being held a minority because they are considered a danger to the community. But in the most of those cases, they are being held in jail because they cannot afford to pay their bail. So how did we get here? A major factor has been the war on drugs, which began in 1971 when President Nixon declared that war. Subsequently, one of his advisors, John Ehrlichman, related that Nixon saw that he had two primary groups of enemies to him and to his administration. One was the anti-war left, and the other was Black people. And so the war on drugs was fashioned in a way that targeted those two groups. Intriguingly, during that period, marijuana was classified as a Schedule I drug, along with heroin and LSD. And so that was his approach to dealing with the anti-war left. During his war on drugs, he dramatically increased the size and presence of the federal drug control agencies. The concept of mandatory sentencing was introduced, and no-knock warrants were allowed for the first time. So that began the ball rolling, and the focus that he propounded was that he was a law and order president. And that role was picked up and amplified by President Reagan, who expanded the war on drugs in 1982. At the time, there was a significant Republican advisor operative named Lee Atwater, and he was recorded saying, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing and states' rights and law and order and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. And so it really marked a significant introduction and expansion of the use of what we now call dog whistles. These are seemingly benign phrases that have very significant pejorative meanings to the audience for whom they're intended. And we certainly have seen the expansion of that in recent years. And so as President Reagan took on the war on drugs, even though illegal drug use had been declining by that period of time, in 1980, there were 50,000 arrests for drug crimes across the country. By 1997, there were 400,000, and these were nonviolent drug offenses. And during this period of time, the emergence of crack cocaine occurred. At the same time, President Reagan had a significant emphasis in terms of his racial appeals against welfare cheats. He began invoking a story of a Chicago welfare queen with 80 names, 30 addresses, and 12 social security cards, who's collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Often Reagan placed this mythical welfare queen behind the wheel of a Cadillac, tooling around in flashy splendor. And beyond that, he began invoking the unfairness to hardworking white people by describing the strapping young buck standing ahead of you in the grocery store line buying T-bone steaks while all you could afford was hamburger. So part of this emphasis, in addition to Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 that Congress passed, and it differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. And the rationale was important. Crack cocaine is cheaper than powder cocaine, and so it tends to be the drug of choice for poorer people, and was certainly the case for poor Black people living in inner city areas. It has been demonstrated over and over and over again with studies that Black and white people use drugs at approximately the same rates. But this focus was on crack cocaine. This Anti-Drug Abuse Act also introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes that ranged between 5 and 10 years, depending on the nature of the crime. And this was not for drug sales. Many of these were simply for drug use. There were some modifications made in 1988, but the differential was such that you received the same sentence for possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine that it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to initiate the same sentence. Now, during the next election period, Bill Clinton was running for president, and Democrats were cast as being soft on crime. And so Bill Clinton was determined that he would not be seen in that light. He was going to be a new Democrat. He was going to be a different Democrat. And so as a little bit of background, we're going to go to the South, to Stone Mountain. In 1915, the movie Birth of a Nation was released, and it began a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, particularly in the South. And so the Klan held a resurrection ceremony at Stone Mountain to say, we're back. And then the group held regular events there. In the 1920s, they began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they raised enormous amounts of money that resulted in the creation of the bas-relief sculpture on Stone Mountain that shows Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee astride charging stallions. Every year, the Klan held its annual Labor Day cross burning at Stone Mountain, and those rallies persisted until 1991. So, in 1994, just before Super Tuesday, Bill Clinton held a rally at Stone Mountain, and he was accompanied by 3 of the most virulently racist people in the South: Georgia's Governor Zell Miller, Senator Sam Nunn, and Congressman Ben Jones. And strikingly, the backdrop were the prisoners from the small local federal penitentiary at Stone Mountain. Now, if you look closely, you can see a couple of white faces in that group, but you have to look pretty close to see them. And so the message he was conveying was carefully crafted and intended to deliver the desired result. And so during Clinton's presidency, Congress passed in 1994 the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the famous 3 strikes, you're out. That's 3 felonies, and the sentence is life in prison without parole. More than half of the people who have been convicted and incarcerated because of the 3 strikes law committed only nonviolent acts. So 3 nonviolent felonies, often drug charges, and it's life in prison without parole, even for juveniles. And instructively, if you were sentenced to death in the American prison system, justice system, you were entitled to certain legal representation and a certain appeals process to help ensure that America does not put to death any innocent people. That's not working so well. But in any case, if you were sentenced to life in prison without parole, there is no assistance. And if you are to attempt any appeals, they have to be carried out on your own without any subsidy or support for legal assistance. And as it's been said, it's much better in America to be rich and guilty than innocent and poor. This Violent Crime Control Act also introduced 60 new death penalty offenses, even as sentiment opposing the death penalty was growing in the United States. And it added an additional $10 billion funding for state prisons and $11 billion for state and local police forces. Now, at the time, some sentiment was growing to address this disparity in sentencing differentials between crack and powder cocaine and between sentences for Black and white citizens. And so Congress formed the US Sentencing Commission, and it did some significant work and determined that the racial bias in sentencing needed to be addressed. And so it made a report to Congress recommending some significant changes, among them reducing the disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, even though the drugs are pharmacologically identical. But Congress rejected the sentencing report. And so the disparities continued until 2010, when finally Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act that addressed some of these disparities. At the same time, it was necessary to create some incentives for law enforcement because the federal government was not putting in place federal agents in every state and city in order to deal with drug crime. So they needed to enlist the assistance of state and local law enforcement agencies. And they did that with a series of incentives. In 1982, they began by giving federal cash grants to state and local law enforcement agencies if they would make the enforcement of drug laws a priority. I mean, prior to this, the local and state agencies had been involved in in addressing all sorts of crimes. But part of the war on drugs meant prioritizing drug arrests. And so federal cash grants were given. In 1984, Congress expanded and the Supreme Court authorized the federal civil asset forfeiture. That is a process by which officers and agents may lawfully seize the property or money of individuals that they suspect of committing or helping to commit a crime. So if they believe a drug crime is being committed, they can seize the property of the individuals involved. And it doesn't even have to just be those people directly involved. It can be their spouses, it can be their other residents in the home, it can be their neighbors. And there need be no charges ever filed, let alone a conviction ever occurring, but the property becomes that of the federal government. That actually began the seizure of drugs and equipment in 1970. In 1978, that was expanded to say the government could take cash and securities. With this act in 1984, the government could seize real property. And in 1986, it was expanded to say the government could seize other property equal in value to the property that would otherwise have been seized. And importantly, this law also allowed for something called equitable sharing, because the state and local governments had had the ability to seize civil assets, but there were very strict laws typically at the state level as to how those assets could be used. And in many instances, the value reverted to the state for use as part of its general budgeting and fiscal process. But by sharing with the federal government with this new civil asset forfeiture law, it bypassed the state laws, and basically all of the assets seized could be used for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries and overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, and detention facilities. So it was an enormous boon to law enforcement agencies to get this influx of cash. In 1986, the amount seized amounted to $93.7 million. In 2013, the amount seized was $4.2 billion, all of which went to law enforcement agencies. At the same time, in 1988, burn grants were given so that states would set up narcotics task forces. In the 1990s, cash grants were given based on the number of drug arrests. And in the late 90s, there were 3.4 million individual orders of Pentagon equipment sent to state law enforcement agencies. And we certainly have seen the evidence, the consequences of that process. The collateral damage of all of this has been significant. First, and not always visibly, the assault on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized." So there had been a number of Supreme Court decisions that had begun weakening the power of the Fourth Amendment. And in 1968, in Terry v. Ohio, the court substantially expanded police power to search and seize and limiting the right to privacy of individuals. Prior to that, it was generally understood that police could not stop and search someone without a warrant, unless there was probable cause to believe that the individual was engaged in criminal activity. But the Terry decision expanded the notion of warrantless search to suspicious behavior as a preventative measure. And so the Supreme Court affirmed that police officers could interrogate and frisk individuals, suspicious individuals, without probable cause. And that ruling was applied to target African Americans for wearing flat brim hats and hooded sweatshirts, because these were suspicious behaviors. And so stop and frisk exploded in many areas across the country. And then further, in 1996, another Supreme Court decision, Wren v. United States, further limited the privacy rights of individuals by allowing law enforcement the ability to stop a person in a motor vehicle based on a pretext. So there needed be no probable cause, but the process could begin. And so this resulted in significant increase in arrests, charges, convictions, and incarceration. And that incredible increase in people incarcerated had an incredible effect in disrupting social relationships, as particularly men, but occasionally women, went to prison. Family structures were damaged. Economic security was impacted. And again, this was disproportionately visited upon people of color in our country. And we also saw the result of all of that Pentagon equipment going to state law enforcement agencies in the militarization of the police and a concomitant increase in the use of excessive force. You know, there are sort of two views of law enforcement or military personnel. There is the warrior and the guardian. And when you're talking about the armed forces and the military, you are talking about warriors. It's kill or be killed. That is what war is all about. But in all of these police forces across the country, where the motto tends to be protect and serve, the role of the police is appropriately guardian. And that means guardian of all. But the effect of many of these legal changes and actions associated with the war on drugs has produced more of a warrior mentality in many police officers and police departments across the country. And it has led to a significant erosion in the community's belief in the motto of protect and serve. We saw an explosion in life sentences without parole. That number has quadrupled since 1984. And this whole system of incarceration is fed by the process of probation and parole. Incarceration is just one piece of the system of corrections. More than half of the 7 million people involved in the system of corrections are on probation or parole. And the issue there is that any violation of probation or parole can result in the individual being reincarcerated before the charges are even heard in court. And many of these charges have to do with requirements that people on probation or parole report in to a corrections officer on a regular basis, that they report any changes of address, that they are not found to be in possession of alcohol or a firearm. But as we'll see, many of these individuals who are released from prison have difficulty finding housing, have difficulty finding jobs, have difficulty getting any form of public support. And as a consequence, their living circumstances are always in flux. They often have problems with access to transportation. They can't get to see a parole officer. They move frequently because they're staying with friends and relatives. And every time they go to stay with a different person, they don't report their address change. And so for these minor violations of probation and parole, they are back incarcerated yet again. Now, as we watch this order of magnitude increase in incarcerated individuals in the country, we did learn that one of the acts of Congress was to provide $10 billion to the states to build more prisons. And in fact, there was a period of time when a new prison was being built in the country every 2 weeks. But it did reach a point where the states had problems supporting all of these prisoners. The funding was simply not available. And so the capitalist solution emerged to create private for-profit prisons. In 1998, there were 5 in America. By 2008, there were 100. And their profits that year were up 500% over the year before. For those of us involved in business in whatever form, we know the calculation of profit. It is income minus expenses. And so if you are being judged as the manager of a for-profit prison and you have stockholders, any money that you spend on rehabilitating your prisoners or providing them with skills and education that might help them once they return to society, those dollars spent reduce your profit. And so it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think about how much money might be expended on rehabilitation. And even more cynically and darkly, if people are well prepared to re-enter society when they leave prison, they're unlikely to come back. But if they're not prepared, they become yet another source of future income. And then, at what might seem to be a very minor level, we have the impact of cash bail and fines and fees. We've already talked about the fact that of the 2.3 million people incarcerated today, more than 500,000 are there because they can't make bail. But in addition, the fines and fees that are assessed for misdemeanors is having a significant effect on Americans as well. In the state of Delaware, 25% of the men in prison are awaiting trial, and 40% of the women in prison are awaiting trial because they can't pay, for the most part, because they cannot pay their bail. So imagine if these men our fathers and husbands, these men are mothers and wives, the impact of their families, of them sitting in jail for lack of the amount of money to pay bail. And further, in the state of Delaware, if you are delinquent in paying a fine that you have been assessed or fees that you have been assessed, a warrant can be issued for your arrest. In 2019, almost 45,000 warrants were issued for the arrest of people who were delinquent in paying their fines and fees. Automatic upon the issuing of the warrant is the suspension of your driver's license. So you can't afford to pay your fine. And now you can't legally drive. So you have a choice. You stop driving, perhaps you lose your job, or you keep driving and you run the risk that you will be stopped and fined. And that amount of money that you owed before is now doubled or tripled. There are attempts being made to address this in the state of Delaware, but there is some significant resistance. And part of the issue is the word fees. There are numerous examples where there's a $100 fine for a parking violation or a moving violation. But then a $55 non-jury trial fee is added, a $10 court security assessment is tacked on, $1 for the video phone fund, $15 for the fund to combat violent crimes, $10 for the volunteer ambulance company fund, a $10 victims compensation fund, $100 public defender fee, even though you didn't use a public defender, and a $200 probation fee. All of these are agencies that should be funded by the state governments, but instead they are being funded by being tacked on to fines assessed against individuals. And so the pushback has been pretty extreme, but it must be addressed. So where are we in today's criminal justice system? What we have seen is a significant erosion in our Fourth Amendment rights, and those can end up affecting every one of us, not just those that we're talking about who are the targets of the war on drugs. And significantly, our criminal justice system is racialized at every stage, from beginning to end. Blacks are stopped at a disproportionate rate compared to whites. When stopped, an arrest results at a disproportionate rate. When charges are filed, they are filed more often against Black than white citizens, and the charges tend to be more severe. The bail conditions are harder. The availability of legal representation is reduced. The whole issue of plea bargain versus going to trial results in convictions at an alarming rate. Sentencing shows this racial bias, and the opportunity for appeals is damaged. In fact, in Massachusetts, a judge looked at the circumstances in Massachusetts prisons and asked the question why there were so many Black people in prison. And so a study was commissioned with Harvard University to answer his question. And they reviewed more than 1 million cases. It was a study done over a 4-year period of time. It was just released a couple of months ago. 665 of every 100,000 Blacks were in prison in Massachusetts versus 82 of every 100,000 whites. Blacks make up 24% of the population in Massachusetts, but 63% of the stop and frisk and searches. More Blacks than whites are detained without bail, and the bail is set higher for them. Higher offenses are charged, and they are more frequently referred to Superior Court. And when looking at the average sentence for the same crimes, The average sentence for a Black prisoner is 168 days longer than that of a white prisoner. And this isn't only happening in Massachusetts.
All right, Sue, are we ready for questions?
Sure.
All right, folks,
Questions, comments?
discourse is now yours. Just a reminder to use the reaction button at the bottom and the raise your hand function in that sub menu so I can see who has a question. All right, Diana Long-Henry.
Seems to me like we need a very large nationwide dose of integrity and reschooling as to what that means. And to put to put glasses on people so that makes them colorblind.
I think the issue of colorblind in the sense of equitable treatment of everyone is the goal.
Yep.
The need to appreciate how uncolorblind all of our systems are. And in fact, how at some level uncolorblind we all are as well requires some introspection and some reflection and some coming to terms with how all of this history affects us. But certainly that equitable treatment, regardless of skin color or economic condition, is essential. And it's all of us. It's 350 million people and all of our agencies and institutions. Thank you, Diana.
You're welcome.
John Lyon has his hand up.
Yeah, I'm just appalled at how the presidents of the United States have going through from the beginning, from the Eisenhower years in this particular course to today, have made this. I don't get it. I don't understand that they're not supposed to be, and it's all, I know it's all political, but I don't understand how there isn't someone in power that can have the kind of impact that could change the trajectory of how we think about things. And I wish that there would be some way of that happening, but I don't know what the answer is. I don't think a lot of people have the answer, but there are a lot of people that probably feel the same way that I do. But I really didn't realize some of the things that were that Sue had just presented here. It's incredible to me.
This this desire, to Diana's point and to your point, for reconciliation, for coming to terms with all of this and determining where we go from here, has to rest on the truth. And not knowing our history, and not knowing what got us here, and not knowing where we are, not even knowing what's happening today, makes that process of moving forward impossible. And certainly, presidents are elected broadly across the country, but the impact on state and local legislatures that are passing laws that are attempting to deeply constrain the ability of Americans to vote, and we'll be talking about that next week. Certainly the election of just horrifically biased, bigoted senators and representatives in Congress results in the passage of laws that, when implemented, intensify the problem. So first, we need to know what's going on, how we got here, where we are. And then the question becomes one of what do we do about it? And there is opportunity for activism. There is opportunity for advocacy. There is opportunity for things to change, but until we understand where we are, it's just not possible to make that progress. Thank you, John.
Yep.
Donna Feldman, you have your hand up.
Sue, I want to, before anything, I want to thank you again for what you're doing and sharing this and educating us. In my quest to be tolerant, I have believed that we are all entitled to our dislikes, to our feelings, even when they're negative, and to our prejudices. The line is drawn when one acts on those things. You have taught me well today. There is no excuse. And I have to find another way of being. I think tolerance is the key now. I must love others regardless, but I will not tolerate. I will not condone. I will speak up more than even I do to stand for what is right. There is no excuse. And in what God has given us, there is no room for hurting one another. It's not just, I can't. Thank you very much. You made me realize.
All right, Kate Palmer and then Diana.
So I think the Delaware current Attorney General, like within 6 weeks after being elected, and I was actually just trying to look that up on my phone, and I'm spacing out her name because it's something similar to one of my colleagues.
Kathy
She
Jennings.
introduced, yes, and I was calling her Karen. Yes, Kathy Jennings introduced 17 bills, like right after she was elected, that were specific to address the issues that we've talked about today. And I'm not current with where they are, but it's been quite a battle to get them through and even, into the system. So even in Delaware, if we look at Delaware as our state, so to speak, there are things that we can do to support those bills to move through as opposed to them being stuck. So, we think globally, and yet there's something that we can do at home. And there are people in Delaware who are actively trying to right these injustices, and they just need help and support.
You're exactly right, Kay. There's a branch of the ACLU known as Smart Justice Delaware that has been actively involved in this. In fact, in the 2019 legislative session, they introduced 19 or supported 19 bills, many aligned with Kathy Jennings' proposals, although Kathy's went further. But 11 of the 19 were adopted by the legislature. There were lobby days at legislature. I went down to, first time I'd ever been at Legislative Hall, went down for a lobby day. And 11 of them were passed. Now, they were the more minor bills that were introduced, and opposition is significant to some of the more significant bills that have been proposed. The legislature in Delaware established a task force to look at law enforcement, accountability, and it's chaired by one of the legislators, and there are 4 subgroups. And one of the real stumbling blocks that they are facing in terms of police accountability and transparency is the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights in Delaware, which significantly protects law enforcement officers in terms of their actions. And there has been significant pushback from the law enforcement agencies against a number of the reforms that are being proposed. Nevertheless, Delaware is a small state, and what we know is that given our size, it's easier to make our voices heard. A couple of years ago, Leo Strine, who was then the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and C.J. Seitz, who was then a justice and is now the Chief Justice, came to Westminster Church, where I'm a member, and gave a talk on, in essence, racism in Delaware, the Delaware legal system. And one of the comments that they made is that making our voices heard has an outsized impact. Because we're a small state, because people tend to not to pay a great deal of attention to the work in the legislature, when our legislators get a call from 20 people, they pay attention. If they are to get calls from hundreds of people, they will pay a lot more attention. And so what organizations like Smart Justice Delaware and Network Delaware and some of these other groups are doing is trying to make citizens of the state aware of these potential legislative acts and encourage people to send emails, to make phone calls, because it does have an effect. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to know what is being proposed, what its implications are, and then organize ourselves as advocates to make sure that our support for these kinds of initiatives is heard and acted upon by our elected representatives. So there is something we can do, something meaningful we can do.
All right, Diana, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Sue, I'm assuming that there is considerable information or data regarding the no-knock policies that are used so often these days, and the impact that that has on innocent bystanders, in particular children, who witness that violence coming into their homes. And we've seen it, we've seen so much on the news about people who have been completely innocent, and yet their homes have been, doors have been knocked down, and I'm sure more in the Black community than in white neighborhoods.
Yes, Diana, I don't have a lot of that data on hand, but I know there is a great deal of information available both at the federal level and at the state level. I've said if I were to do the research and give this course back when I graduated from college, I'd have spent 8 years sitting on the floor by the card catalog in the library, but Google is an amazing source of information. And so it is possible to easily, readily do research into those kinds of statistics and understand what's happening, certainly in our state and across the country.
Donna Feldman, your hand is up again.
Sue, do you know if Delaware, if the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights in Delaware is the same as like the national, or do we have a separate one? And the second part to that is, where can we read that? I've looked online a little bit here while we were talking, and I don't see the details. Would you have that information?
I think that information is available, and I will look it up and I can make it available. I can send it to John, and then you can determine how to disseminate that.
Thank you.
Pretty much every state has its own whatever they call it, law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, and they vary widely from one state to another. As I understand it, Delaware's is one of the more protective of police officers than some other states that make action with impunity possible. But as we've seen, you know, law enforcement action with impunity is in our DNA. And so it exists to some extent everywhere. But I believe a friend of mine is a member of this task force that's working the legislative task force. And based on her perspective, Delaware's Bill of Rights for police officers offers more protection for police officers than quite a number of states.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I urge you, based on this particular topic, to look up Smart Justice Delaware, see the work that they're doing. You can also follow other threads to see the legislature that's been proposed. The proposals by the Attorney General, Kathy Jennings, are available for you to see as well. I'm sure you know the name and can find the phone number and the email of your state representative and senator. And I suggest that you make frequent use of those contact points, all of us.
Carol C., you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you again. This is just so informative. And maybe it gives me hope that we might be able to make a difference. I live in Pennsylvania, so I don't have quite the smallness that Delaware has. My question has to do with some of the, I guess, some of the things that happened after the George Floyd incident last year has led to movement at the federal level for some criminal justice reform. And I was just wondering, I don't really understand if they come through with reform, how will that then impact? Are you familiar with the exact reforms they're pushing for? I think it has to do with the way in which police handle the way in which they handle things that happen, how they record it, report it, etc. And like when you were talking about how strong a lot of the police, I guess they're like a union, how much protection they have, how much impact and will it be able to be implemented if they come up with some of these reforms that they've been talking about? I know I'm kind of vague because I don't know all the detail, and I was hoping maybe you had some more detail on that.
Well, to the extent to which federal law is passed that addresses specific issues, it overrides the state law, but it still requires action on the part of the states. One of the things I believe that the federal laws are beginning to address are the issues for training for police officers. Because what we're seeing for quite some time in recent years, we've been hearing there are a few bad apples. And certainly there are. But there's also a culture. And the culture is fed by all of this history that we've been learning. And in fact, I think there was a piece in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, not the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, just within the last day or so, that talked about the fact that to some extent, we need to be recruiting different people to be law enforcement officers. And so there's a sort of a cultural change within law enforcement that needs to occur. And that probably would have as profound effect on all of this as anything else. So it's a complicated circumstance legislatively and how all of that works. But for example, Delaware, I think just passed a bill, a law, whatever, about body cameras, that all police officers need to wear body cameras in 5 years. Really? I mean, really?
5 years.
Really? 5 years? So, you know, there are things to be said, voices to be heard, actions to be taken And we need to be doing that. Kay pointed out that the legislative task force subcommittees, their meetings are open to the public. And in fact, they have scheduled quite a number of listening sessions where citizens can go and the subcommittees ask questions and the public responds and the public expresses their thoughts and feelings about the work that they're doing. So it is intended to be an open process. It's well along, not that they're anywhere close to any recommendations, I don't believe, but you can find information about that on the Delaware Legislature website as to what these subgroups are, when they're meeting, and when they're holding listening sessions that are specifically not their meetings, but they're trying to gather community input. So I encourage you to pursue that. Thank you, Kay.
Susan Mack, you have your hand raised.
I'm unmuting now. Just wanted to comment that because of our federal system, you've got federal laws, you've got state laws, and you have federal law enforcement, you have state law enforcement. It makes it very complex. And a lot of as Sue was pointing out, there's laws at the state and local level that affect incarceration and affect how police officers are treated, et cetera. There's also laws at the federal level, but the federal government can influence the state by the power of the purse, which I think when she was talking about how the war on drugs was largely influenced by the power of the purse from the federal government, but basically offering all this monetary incentive for local governments to, increase their enforcement of drug laws and enforce them in certain ways and providing military equipment, et cetera. And in the same way, the federal government can have a more positive impact by giving that same type of influence, the power of the purse, which is a huge influence the federal government has over local governments, by incentivizing reform. And I think, of course, there's a lot of differences on what reform is needed or not needed. And that's what kind of discussion that's taking place now. But, in the federal level, they could certainly be a huge impact on the local governments by encouraging changes at the local level, by funding those changes instead of funding more incarceration and bigger prisons. And unfortunately, the past 30, 40 years, there's been a huge amount of money thrown at increasing incarceration and increasing punishment, basically a punitive culture, instead of a reform culture where you're trying to, reintroduce criminals back into the community. And, there's so many punitive measures. I think Sue pointed out with you don't have access to housing, you don't have access to, educational benefits. You can't get student loans if you have a felony record, things like that. I mean, there's so many barriers that are buried in so many both state and federal programs that present barriers to people that, it's just really kind of eye-opening to learn about them and realize how just the tentacles. And I think hopefully now, there's this new emphasis in reassessing how things are done. And at the state level, there's state laws and state policies that we have a huge amount of impact. I think I didn't fully appreciate probably until the last 10 years or so how much impact local action can have on our state government, because we're a small state. We have a lot more power over that than, quite frankly, over what the federal government does. So there's so much, and there's so much impact on individuals in the state based on state law and state policies and how state funding is issued, that there's just so much we can do at a state and local level. So
That's correct. And if you look at our last legislative elections, there are some significant changes with people who had been in position for a very long time and aren't anymore. So I think there is not just a ray of hope, but a significant opportunity for action here. I mean, imagine if that $4.3 billion in civil asset forfeiture in 1 year, instead of spending it on military equipment and so on, if it had been spent on programs to aid the reentry of people back into society, that was spent on preventive programs that kept people from going to jail in the first place. It's been this last 50 years that this punitive view has become so entrenched. And in the midst of it, somewhere in the midst of it, it used to be that incarcerated people could get Pell Grants to help them get a college education while incarcerated. And somebody decided that that was a really bad idea, that those people were in prison and they didn't deserve a perk like that. And so all of a sudden the law was changed and incarcerated people couldn't get Pell Grants because God forbid we'd want them to have a college education when they got out of prison. I mean, the mindset is just sort of extraordinary. And I think another way that we all can get involved here is in looking for the local organizations that are helping what are not called ex-convicts or felons anymore. They are called returning citizens. They are citizens. That would imply they should be able to vote, yes? So they are citizens and they are returning home. And our job is to help facilitate that return. I just got an email yesterday from a lawyer, an attorney friend of mine, who had helped a man with a personal injury claim. But he is a convicted felon and he is not able to buy a trailer in which he can live because he has a record. He's not able to participate in some of the social safety net programs because he has a record. So we continue to punish people who've served their allotted time. And this whole issue of probation and parole is another one that is coming up on the radar of Smart Justice Delaware and Attorney General Kathy Jennings to say, what is the value of it? And to what extent is it actually helping people or helping society? And to what extent is it just enhancing this revolving door of recidivism? In the state of Delaware, 75% of people released from prison will be re-incarcerated in 3 years. 75%. There has to be a way to fix that.
Any other questions, folks? Oh, Diana Long-Henry.
Sue, that is an astounding percentage, 75% re-incarcerated, not even 5 years, within 3 years. And the taxpayers are paying for it. So that doesn't, it doesn't make sense that we do these things. And I was I used to be of the thought that, well, they're there, they screwed up. So no, they shouldn't have all this stuff. I did not know that they couldn't vote. They couldn't. Well, I've heard about, we have someone close to our family who has done time. I believe he's done his time. And so between your information you just gave and information I've gathered along the way, that now they have problems getting jobs, they have problems buying cars, they have problems finding a place to live because they have this record hanging over their head. I think that just like, when my kids were toddlers, we had to file bankruptcy, but that even has a limit. And then after a while, after a certain period of time, that's off your credit report. I think that incarcerations and everything should also have a time limit. to where, okay, you've done your time. However, you know, what fair probation would be. And you should have a little more, you should be able to get at least the basics, a place to live, some kind of ways to transportation. I mean, if you could pay for it, sure, why shouldn't you be able to buy a car or rent a car or something like that, so that you can provide for yourself, provide for your family, and not end up back in prison because you're doing what you can do to earn money, selling drugs, whatever.
In most places, if you have a felony conviction, you are not eligible for Section 8 housing, for public housing. So that program is not available for you. And of course, private landlords can pretty much make whatever decision they want about whether or not they would rent housing to you. So
now, what was that you said, that if you do have a conviction, you cannot get Section 8 housing?
correct, felony conviction. In most instances, you do not qualify for Section 8 housing, for public housing. There are a few exceptions, but not very many.
We learned about Section 8 housing when we moved to Delaware 27 years ago. There was an apartment complex lived next door to us, and I heard Section 8 housing, and I'm a big fan of MASH. So when I heard Section 8 housing, I'm thinking Klinger. Oh, crazy people could live there. And it's like, no, it's low income housing. What?
Yeah, the wrong Section 8, right.
Yeah. Well, both would cause you concern.
True. Yeah, and somebody, I don't know if it was Brian Stevenson or, you know, one of those really eloquent speakers that said, how would you like your whole life and your whole future to be defined by the worst thing you ever did?
No.
So we do make mistakes.
And we're not perfect.
And we
Only
pay,
God's perfect.
and we pay a price.
And so you pay it, and then I was against second chances for some people, but now, being older, having kids that are older, I'm seeing more of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, give them a second chance. Give them a third chance. But at some point, I still feel the need that, you know, if you keep making the same mistake, you're not learning. So, you know, there's a number on that too, I think. Especially if you're hurting other people.
Carol C., you had your hand raised.
So I keep circling back to this one thing, and part of it has to do with Pennsylvania has something called the Prison Society, which I was totally unaware of until a conversation I had yesterday with someone who is now doing work with them. And it's chartered within the Pennsylvania charter of an organization that sort of works between prisoners and their families and the system, and helps to make sure things are, all sorts of issues that they deal with. But my conversation with him yesterday, and listening to today, and actually because I've been thinking about criminal justice for a bit this past year, I keep coming back to mission statements. Every organization they have mission statements. That's what should be their guiding principles. And in some naive way, I don't know where I ever got this idea from, but I thought that the Penal Code of the United States, that the prison systems within the United States were operating under an assumption that they were there to rehabilitate. And I feel like rehabilitation is not really front and center on what they're trying to do. It seems to me every time I come across things, it's punishment. And unless we get to rehabilitation and make that our primary goal, we're not going to ever get rid of prisons, and we're going to have these rates of 75% get reincarcerated within 3 years. Holy cow. Do you know whether there is a mission statement for the prison system and or a penal code or whatever that includes rehabilitation as part of what they're supposed to be doing? I mean, am I being crazy and thinking that should be, that's part of what they're supposed to do?
Well, I think it has been. In reality, you know, the statistics that I gave back in 1970, I think that there were 200,000 people in prison. The rate of incarceration was dropping at that time. And there actually was a belief that prisons wouldn't exactly go away, but they would be limited to a very particular set of extreme circumstances, because there were things that could be done that enabled people to make a living productively, to not have to engage in illegal activities. And you know, the whole post-war approach to legislation, to benefit systems, to building the middle class, if you will, the investment in the well-being of all, kind of was turned on its head 50 years ago. And this idea of who's deserving and who's not, and who should be punished and who should be rewarded. I think you could have a mission statement for the penal system, but until we deal with these laws, until we deal with these state actions, state and government, state, capital S, state actions, you know, just look, we'll talk next week about voting and the idea that you're released from prison and you don't get to vote. What is that all about? I mean, in Maine and Vermont, I think you can vote while you're in jail. How can you not be represented in Congress, in your state legislatures, just because you committed a crime? How does that make any sense? That shift to punitive was dramatic and has intensified, and it's going to take a lot to swing it back the other way. And I think it's going to need to begin sort of step by step by introducing opportunities for rehabilitation. And it certainly will be state by state, ultimately some federal action. But these laws are still on the books and they're still being enforced as though the overriding purpose is punishment.
Sad. Thank you.
We have time for just one more question.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate seeing you.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue, for taking the time to meet with us when you're in someplace warm and sunny.
Yes, thank
It'll
you.
still
Sue.
be warm and sunny when we're done.
Okay. All
You
right.
look very awake and refreshed for that early hour of the morning.
Are you in
Yeah,
Hawaii
I'm
now?
headed. I'm
She's
headed
in
for a
Hawaii,
nap.
yes.
My cousin's in Hawaii. I'll just go for cocktails tonight.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
See you next
Sue.
week.